So I'm Colleen McCulloch from Soil Association Scotland, and I will just click to the agenda quickly. And of course, it's going to not work. There we go. We've had a few technical issues this morning, but hopefully we'll get on all right. So yeah, we've got an hour and a half to chat about carbon audits and what that kind of looks like on farm, what you can use your carbon audit data for in the kind of context of whole farm planning. So I'll do just a sort of quick introduction, and then we'll hear from Becky Willson from Farm Carbon Toolkit, talking about sort of carbon audits, what sort of information goes into it, what kind of information you get out of it, and why that's useful and what you can do in terms of your sort of management and planning on your farm. And then we're going to hear from Denise Walton, who's an organic farmer in the Borders and also Scotland chair of Nature Friendly Farming Network. And then we'll open it up for discussions and questions and have a bit of a chat and see what kind of questions people have. And so thank you to people who filled in the quick poll beforehand when it was when we did the sort of registration bit. It's useful to kind of just get an idea of what people want to get out of sessions when we do them. So just kind of summarize them into kind of common themes that came out of what people put. So hopefully we can sort of address these today, understanding the whole farm planning requirements, what information goes into a carbon audit, hearing about what other farmers are doing in terms of audits, whole farm planning, reducing their impact, and around soil as well. There was a few things around carbon and soil and that kind of relationship and inputs, you know, what you put into your soil. So hopefully we can sort of cover some of those, and anything that we don't cover in the presentations, put your questions in the chat and we can bring that into the discussion afterwards as well. So whole farm planning is a project that Soil Association Scotland has been running for the last almost year and a half, kind of tying the new requirements for your basic payments and the sort of audits and what the requirements are into how that translates into farm management decision making, you know, seeing a farm as a holistic system rather than sort of separate areas or enterprises. So we will share links at the end and during the webinar to our website that's got lots of resources around all the whole farm plan audits and lots of sort of technical guides and videos, webinar recordings and things. We've done, I think, 8 farm walks and 9 webinars, I think, so far on sort of all the different areas of whole farm planning and how they tie together. So we'll share information on interesting bits of the website just for further information for folk. So whole farm plans as a sort of requirement for basic payments came into effect last year in 2025. And there are 5 audits that I'll touch on in a minute. And the kind of longer term aim of kind of starting baselining audits is to get people using the data that they collect to inform better decision making, lowering inputs, making systems more resilient, sustainable, efficient. So that's the sort of goal behind bringing in the sort of compliance side, and also from the Scottish Government point of view, tying it to climate and biodiversity targets as well. So there's 5 areas of whole farm plans in terms of the sort of requirement: carbon, which we'll talk about today, animal health and welfare, soil, IPM, biodiversity, and of course they all kind of interlink. And I think all of these we have webinars upcoming actually between now and the end of March. So do look at our events page on our website if you're interested in any of the other areas. But these are the sort of 5 key areas that you need to do audits for a whole farm plan. And then sort of slightly broken down, soil analysis, carbon audits and habitat surveys need to be done on a 5-year rolling basis. And the integrated pest management plan and animal health and welfare plan, which is a mouthful, are annual ones. So not everybody has to do all of these. Obviously, if you don't have livestock, you wouldn't need to do that one. Everyone will need to do a habitat survey and a carbon audit, and everyone who has Region 1 soil or Region 1 land needs to do soil analysis. And as last year, in 2026, you can pick two out of these to do out of the five, or out of how many apply to your farm or croft situation. Um, so if you haven't got livestock, you don't need to worry about that. And if you did two last year, um, two of the 5 year ones, for example, if they're still current and in date from last year, then they cover you. They sort of tick your boxes for this year in terms of your form filling for basic payment. If you did the two annual ones last year, you would need to update them again this year to be compliant for 2026. You can start with whichever one you want to start with in terms of what order you do them in. But I think for a lot of people, soil analysis and carbon audits are useful ones to start with, because that gives you a baseline of sort of lots of different areas of your farm or croft, or they relate to lots of different areas. How you manage your soil, what you put on it or in it, massively influences your carbon audit and the information that goes out into that and comes out of that. Your sort of other things that go into your carbon audit, like your sort of tree stocks, depending on which one you do, has an influence on your habitat and biodiversity value, and how that relates to then water management around the farm. If you've got trees and hedges, that can sort of factor into your carbon footprint, but then also into the biodiversity side and the habitat. If you've got hedges connecting different areas of trees, that will increase your biodiversity value. Shade and shelter from trees and hedges influences animal health and welfare and provides habitat for pest predators, for example. So all of these plans tie in if you're able to use the information in them to sort of look at everything as one holistic system. So the focus of today will be the carbon audits, and Becky will talk more in depth about carbon audits, how to do them, what goes into them, and the sort of aim from the Scottish Government point of view for getting everybody to do a carbon audit is to get a sort of national baseline on where we're at just now, in a national sense, but allow people individually as well to identify areas of high emissions, and ways to lower those emissions, reduce costs, reduce inputs, external inputs, and then think about sequestration potential depending on management as well. So we'll hear a lot more detail about that in a moment. If you have done a carbon audit in 2025, that will still be valid this year. It's sort of a rolling 5 year update for your audit for the whole farm plan requirements. There is funding available through Preparing for Sustainable Farming scheme, which you can find. We'll share a link afterwards to that, and it's also on our webpage. And I think applications are open until the end of February, so there's not long. If you've already done a carbon audit or are about to do one, you can apply for funding through the Preparing for Sustainable Farming scheme. FAS carbon audits have been paused for the moment because they had very high uptake for those. And there's lots of different tools that you can use, but I'll let Becky talk about that a bit more, and the kind of outputs that you get and how to sort of interpret that. So that's what we're going to focus on today. And then sort of relating back to the slide with the 5 plans, that kind of everything integrates into everything else. So kind of knowing what your carbon footprint is like and knowing how you manage your soil then can sort of help set objectives or make management decisions around soil health and how you manage that, managing nutrients, how you reduce external inputs if you use those, or how to build soil fertility without inputs. And that then relates to water management, trees, pest diseases, animal health and welfare, all ties in together with the aim of sort of building resilience and improving sustainability and profit margins, as well as sort of having a healthier system overall. So I will stop sharing at that point. Is there any burning questions before we hand over to Becky? I wasn't able to see the chat or anything. Hello to the people that have introduced themselves, and thanks to Jane for putting the upcoming events page in the chat. But yeah, if anybody's got any burning questions, shout out just now, and otherwise I'll pass over to Becky. No, I think Becky, you're good to go. And I'll let you introduce yourself. Becky Willson from Farm Carbon Toolkit.
Brilliant. Thank you ever so much for inviting me along today. It's really exciting to be here with you to talk about my favourite subject, carbon. How do we make the most of our carbon audit? How do we turn it from something which is just something that we need to do, as Colleen was telling us, in terms of to comply with schemes or boxes? How do we get the real value out of that? And that's what I'm really going to try and spend the next sort of 40 minutes talking to you about. As Colleen said, if you've got questions, if you've got comments, we'll have time at the end to talk about them, but do chuck them in the chat and we'll go through them as we were. But just to introduce myself, so my name's Becky. I work for an organisation called the Farm Carbon Toolkit. We're a farmer-led organisation really aiming to try and provide practical tools and resources for farmers on all the fun stuff: reducing greenhouse gas emissions, improving energy resilience, improving business resilience, with a particular focus on soil health. And as I say, what I'm going to try and take us through this morning is really to sort of try and understand a bit of an introduction into this topic. What are we thinking about to make sure that we're all on the same page in terms of some of the acronyms and the terminology and what we're really talking about when we're thinking about measuring carbon on the farm. Then we're going to think a little bit more widely around, okay, if we sort of work out why we need to manage it, and in order to manage it, we need to measure it, what are we actually trying to measure? How does that work? How do we turn these sort of complex biological systems into something that we can put on a spreadsheet? And then more importantly, how do we interpret the results and what do we do about it? Because with all of these sorts of things, measuring is only the start. It's really, really important, as we've spoken about already, to have a baseline. Baseline information gives us numbers, gives us data, gives us a starting point, puts that stake in the ground and says, this is where we are now. But the really exciting thing happens when we work out the so what. What can we do with that? Is that number good? Is that number not particularly good? Where are the bits that we're doing fantastically well? And where are the bits where we potentially can make those changes? And as Colleen said earlier, how also can we understand how those changes are also linked to improving business performance, improve resilience, improve animal performance, improve crop performance, improve nutrient balance, all those other sorts of things. So that's what we'll be focusing on this morning. But just a little bit of an intro into Farm Carbon Toolkit for anybody that doesn't know. As I say, we were set up back in 2009 to really try and provide practical tools and resources for farmers. We are by farmers for farmers, so we have a board of directors who are all farmers. We are employee owned, and as I say, we're really trying to provide those tools and resources that help farmers make better decisions. And that comes in a range of different formats. We do lots of different things, but fundamentally we work with farmers. And we work with farmers under three key areas, really. Number one, we work with farmers to measure. And a lot of what we'll be talking about today is around that measurement bit, because as I said earlier, data is incredibly important. Having a starting point, understanding what that number is, and then more importantly, what can we do with it? And a key resource that we use in terms of to do that measuring is our carbon calculator. And obviously there are various different calculators available. And what I'm going to be talking about this morning very much is the overall principles about how we measure carbon, rather than being particularly tool specific, but measurement is a key part of that. And as I say, whether that is measuring your carbon balance, so understanding and quantifying where you are currently generating those greenhouse gas emissions, what you're also currently doing in terms of delivering those solutions through how you're managing your land, your forestry, your hedgerows, your habitats and your soils. Our carbon balance simply is subtraction sum, emissions takeaway, sequestration, which gives us that overall balance. And that can be the starting point. But also, it's not just about measuring our carbon footprint, it's also about understanding those key assets on the farm. So how do we quantify what's happening in terms of the amazing ecosystem that is below our feet? So I'm often to be found down a hole. It is my happy place in terms of looking at how much carbon we have within our soils, but how that links into soil health. And also, more importantly, how that can then inform how we might want to manage those fields and the wider farm moving forward. So measurement's really important. But you can only get so excited about data. The really exciting bit comes when you go, well, okay, so what? What does that information mean? And how can we use that information to then make the changes, do the exciting bit? And how do we understand what are those practices that we might be able to do and the impact that they're going to have? And so we spend a lot of time standing out in fields, sitting around kitchen tables with farmers, talking to groups of farmers about saying, what does this information mean, and what does this mean in terms of what you can do off the back of it? So how practically can we turn something that often is a little bit theoretical in terms of a number of tons of carbon dioxide equivalent into actually, how does this mean I need to manage my stock, my soil, my grass and my cropping rotations, my fertilizer, and turn that into something tangible? Because one of the challenges that we have is sometimes carbon can be a little bit theoretical, but in reality it is incredibly linked to what we're trying to do day to day in terms of our practice. And the other thing that we do is we work with farmers to actually start to talk about all of this sort of stuff. So to try and turn it into something which means that we can understand it, which means that we can see the relevance to what we're doing day to day. We can understand how what we're doing in terms of our management will impact on our carbon footprint and what are the levers that we can pull. Because as we'll learn as we go through in a minute, although we're complicated, although we have these complex biological systems and we both are able to contribute to greenhouse gases, we are also the industry that can deliver the solution. And the really interesting bit, and if you take nothing else away from today, making those changes in terms of either reducing emissions or improving sequestration has a direct benefit to your business. Okay, so I actually don't care if you don't do any of the things that we might be talking about, because they're going to reduce emissions, because at the same time they're also going to benefit your business. And we are one of those industries that can do these things and can make these changes on our farm without having to have significant investment like other industries. And at the same time, we're also able to offer that solution through how we hold carbon in our soils and in our woody biomass. One of the challenges that we have sometimes when we're thinking about this topic more widely is that there's a huge amount of terminology and jargon and acronyms that are used that often don't mean a huge amount to us. And it's quite worth just thinking about, what do some of these things mean, and how do they impact on what I'm trying to do day to day? And so I just thought we quickly touch on these to make sure that we're all happy with them. So CO2e, that is the unit of measurement that we use for reporting our carbon footprints. Now, for most other industries, that E is not very important, because all of the emissions that are coming is predominantly from the burning of fossil fuels and energy. Okay, so all of that is coming from carbon dioxide. But for us within agriculture, that E is really important, because the vast majority of our emissions, that pie chart, that donut chart that Colleen put up earlier, you'll see that carbon dioxide is only a small proportion of emissions. The vast majority of those emissions are coming from two other gases. They're coming from nitrous oxide and they're coming from methane. And so in order to do our reporting, we have to turn those non-carbon dioxide gases into their carbon dioxide equivalent. Okay, and so although we talk about, and the unit is that carbon dioxide equivalent, we need to understand that underneath that, for agriculture, carbon is only a small proportion. We're predominantly thinking about emissions that are coming from nitrous oxide and methane. So when we're thinking about those management practices and those things that we want to do, it's not just about energy, it's also about how we manage our stock, our rotations, our soils, our nutrients and our manures. And, you know, there are different ways that we can account for those gases, and that is that sort of GWP thing in terms of the global warming potential, those ability for those gases to cause global temperature rise over a certain time period. And you might hear different conversations about whether we look at these things over 100 years, which is that GWP 100, or whether we account for some of those more cycling gases like methane in a different way, which might be using units of measurement like GWP star. One of the reasons why we're doing all of this measuring and baselining is to be able to show the contribution that agriculture and more widely towards net zero. Now, what is net zero? Again, we could spend a whole 45 minutes talking about it. We're not going to do that. But at a simplest level, net zero, reduce our emissions as much as we possibly can do. And then any residual emissions that we're left with, balance out by increasing removals in terms of taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, so that the overall position is one of net zero. Now, that net zero position might be for an individual farm, it might be for a supply chain, it might be for a landscape, or it might be for Scotland. okay? But it's really important that it's not just about business as usual and plant a forest. It's very much reduce those emissions as well as thinking about the opportunities to enhance removals. And as I said already, agriculture, we're really good because we can do both of those things. And our ability to contribute towards that sort of climate solution comes from our ability to do that sequestration. Sequestration, that act of taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and holding it on our farms. And that might be within how we manage our trees, our hedgerows. It might be through how we manage our environmental areas and also what we do beneath our feet. Now, you could say, well, okay, why all of a sudden are people interested in our carbon footprint? And that really comes to thinking about these net zero ambitions that have been set down, but also on farm, we're not in our own little bubble. We exist and we are part of landscapes, we're part of local communities, but we're also part of supply chains. And a lot of our supply chains, a lot of the organizations and industries that we interact with want to know what's happening on our farm because it contributes to their sort of scope 3 emissions. So if we think about on a farm, we have a variety of emissions that sit within different buckets. Firstly, our scope 1 emissions, which are our direct emissions. So the hectares of wheat that we're growing, the number of cattle. Our scope 2 emissions are the embedded emissions that's coming with purchased electricity that's coming onto the farm. And then our scope 3 emissions are the embedded emissions in all the things that come onto the farm. So the amount of fertilizer, feed, other things, plastic that we're wrapping our silage bales with, chem cans, everything that comes onto the farm comes onto a farm with a farm carbon footprint. Okay. If we go more widely up the supply chain, we, in terms of the things that we produce, are our supply chain scope 3 emissions. So as they do their reporting, they want to understand the proportion that's coming from that bit that what we're doing on the farm, which is why we're suddenly having a lot of the spotlight focused on us. So hopefully that's given you a little bit of an introduction, but let's just think more widely around, well, why should we be interested in carbon footprint? Yes, as Colleen said already, we have to do it, but what other value does that have for me on my farm? And again, we can think about this in various different ways. We can think about the big picture stuff. And we know that, as I say, we have national legislation, we have international targets in terms of the Paris Climate Agreement that says that all of these sorts of ambitions and these targets are to help us reduce the impact on climate change. Now, for a farmer, we know, and I'm sure we've all spent a huge amount of time having conversations about the impact of the weather on our business. So irrespective of climate targets, farmers are directly impacted by the changing climate. And if we look at what's happened over the last 12 months, we know when we have periods of extreme wet, periods of extreme dry, that has a real impact on what we can do day to day. Okay, so that over and above thinking about reducing emissions is something which really sharpens our focus. As I've said already, bigger picture, we also have supply chain drivers, because as farmers, we're at the middle of a lot of those conversations and we are providing that scope 3 emission for a lot of people. And originally that might just be our supply chains, but we're now starting to see with banks, with insurance institutions, with others that want to understand what's happening. So having your footprint and having a baseline to be able to then have those conversations with the people that are wanting that gives you sort of future-proofs you and allows you to be ready for those things. Okay. But if we zoom down and think about what's the value for me at a farm level in terms of doing my carbon footprint, well, as I said already, it makes business sense. There's a really good relationship between efficient use of resources and a reduction in your carbon footprint. So by doing a carbon footprint and by understanding where your emissions are coming from, and more importantly, what you can do about it, you can improve the profitability and the performance of your business. And at the moment, with the increasing volatility and input prices and all of those sorts of things, the more we can do to have that really good stable footing, the better. It also helps improve the resilience of your business, both in terms of, as I say, protecting you against those volatile input prices, but more importantly, if we can get our soils to act more like a sponge, we can hold more water, we can actually continue to grow things when it's hot. We can also allow the increasing amount of water that's falling out of the sky, we can hold that and use that when we need to. But also doing a carbon footprint allows you the opportunity to take a step back from your business and look at it through another lens. Okay. And it allows you to make those informed decisions. So when you're thinking about what might I want to do as I move forward in my business over the next 6 months, 12 months, as well as thinking about the practicalities and the financial impact, you can also think about the carbon impact. And that can be really, really useful over and above that sort of business planning, because it will also help support grant applications, things with banks, all of those other sorts of things, because it shows that you're on that front foot, understanding the impact. And that whole process of managing carbon on the farm starts by being able to measure it, okay? And I know, and I totally accept that for a lot of you, the idea of doing your carbon footprint is not something that fills you with joy. You don't wake up in the morning and go, yes, today is the day I get to do my carbon footprint. I do, I am that person, but I realise I'm a very small group. But identifying your carbon footprint is that first step in terms of being able to quantify the contribution that what's happening on your farm, okay? And at the simplest level, I'm sure we've all read loads of things about there are 75 million different carbon calculators. It's going to take me from now until Christmas to complete. It's horrendously complicated and it's all just hideous. Okay, but at the simplest level, all a carbon footprint calculator is doing is it's identifying the amount and the source of those 3 different greenhouse gases, so carbon dioxide, methane and nitrous oxide, that are being emitted from the farm, and then highlights areas where you might be able to make improvements or changes to reduce it. Okay, they should also highlight where you're currently sequestering carbon, doing that incredibly important bit that we can do as farmers, and allow you to evaluate future projects. As I said already, carbon calculators should allow you to become more aware and make informed decisions. But those metrics that you use need to be relevant. So they need to make sense to your business. They need to be practical. So again, they need to be trying to link into what can you actually do with it. They need to be consistent. And again, that's often one of the really big bugbears for farms. And also they need to be that first step in terms of informing behavioural change. So the process of doing your carbon footprint calculator shouldn't be so hideous that you have to go and lie down in a darkened room for 3 weeks to get over it. It's the first bit that allows you to say, so what? What does this information mean? And how can I take this forward in terms of informing future management on my farm? It's also worth just thinking again, how does it actually work? How does calculating carbon footprint work? And there are 2 bits of information that you need to that are important to actually calculate what's happening. So the simple logic of how we do a carbon footprint calculator is that for each item that you use, there is a published emissions factor. And that emissions factor quantifies the amount of greenhouse gas that is emitted per the unit of what you're using. So if we take this simple example, if we want to look at the carbon footprint associated with the litres of diesel that we've used on the farm, as the farmer, we enter the number of litres of diesel we've used. Behind the scenes, that is then multiplied by the emissions factor, and we get the carbon footprint for on-farm diesel usage. And in case anybody's interested, carbon footprint of a litre of diesel, 3.4 kilos of carbon dioxide equivalent. If we've used 10,000 litres, multiply the 2 together, and that's what we get. Now, for all other sectors, that is literally as complicated as it gets. We know quite well how much energy we've used. There isn't a huge amount of discussion about what that emissions factor is because we can quantify and understand everything along, and that's what we do, okay? But as I said, we're not just dealing with carbon dioxide and we're not just dealing with energy, we're dealing with complex systems. So, and this is sometimes where some of the variation comes in terms of calculators. So if we try and follow that same logic and we say that for each item, there's a published emissions factor, and we try and associate that with something that's a little bit more biological, well, we probably know quite over that sort of time period, we know how many cattle we've got, or sheep, or if we want to use an arable context, how many hectares of wheat or barley we were growing. We know that. We can pick that up quite easily. But suddenly, in terms of the emissions factor, rather than there just being one specific number, what we need to do is we need to refine that emissions factor to fit our system. So suddenly, rather than just having to enter information about the number of cattle, we also want to know whether it's a beef cow or a dairy cow. We want to know whether it's a calf, or we want to know whether it's had 3 calves of its own. We want to know it's being fed, because that will govern methane emissions. We want to know how we're managing its manure. So is it out of grass or is it in a shed? All of these things will suddenly mean that we can have an emissions factor that is most relevant to our system. And so when we come to think about data and what data goes into an audit, as some of the questions were coming back, it's really important for the core thing that you are producing on the farm, be it beef, lamb, pork, chicken, wheat, barley, that you try and enter as much information as possible into those core categories, because this is where your management and what you're doing will have an impact, okay? So sometimes when you look at your calculator, whichever calculator you use, it can look like a really overwhelming amount of information that you need to put in. What I would say is really, really focus and try and get as good and as accurate information as possible on those categories which are forming the core part of your business. So, and also because those are the things which will generate the majority of the emissions. And if you can make those as accurate as you possibly can do, then you can have confidence that the figure that's coming out is representative of your system. But also, more importantly, when you start to think about what you might want to do differently, that nuance and that of your management can then be reflected back through the results. So as I've said already, carbon calculators are just another lens to look at your business efficiency through. It allows you that opportunity to step back and go, okay, what's going on? Okay. And as you can see here, the starting point for that looking at your business is almost the end point from a carbon footprint calculator, is your carbon balance. So as I said earlier, this is our carbon balance, which is totaling up all of our emissions, then taking away any offset or removal. So that's carbon that's been taken out of the atmosphere and is being held on the farm. And one take away the other gives us our carbon balance. And that, as you can see here, is reported in terms of tons of CO2e per year. Now, unlike your bank account, if you have a negative number at the bottom here, that's a good thing, okay? Because if you had a negative carbon balance, that means that you are removing from the atmosphere more carbon than you're emitting, okay? If that carbon balance was zero, you're at net zero. Now, the thing to remember here, especially within agricultural systems, is that agricultural systems are leaky. Even if you went out tomorrow and got rid of all agricultural activity that's happening across our landscapes would still be producing these gases as a result of our carbon and nitrogen cycle. Okay, so we are never going to get to a point where our carbon balance, that emissions at the top, says zero. Okay, but before we all get too depressed, we also are the one that have the ability to do that removal as well. So those are the things to remember. But also, when we start looking at the results, irrespective of which calculator you use, a way to think about it is carbon calculators. It's a little bit like an onion. Okay, there are layers, and the more you delve into the layers and understand it, the more exciting it gets. So this tells us something. This gives us that overall position in terms of understands what our emissions are, understands what's currently happening in terms of removals, but it doesn't tell us a huge amount more. We wouldn't really want to compare this to another farm. We could potentially compare our carbon balance to ourselves over time. We could break that down in terms of per hectare. We could break that down in terms of a per ton, because we're producing these emissions for the sake because we're producing something. But it's not going to really give us much indication in terms of what we're doing from a management perspective. We're going to unpeel the layers and go down a level. Okay, and then we can start looking at categories. Now, again, one of the big bugbears of farmers often is why do footprinting tools vary? Again, there's a lot of narrative around, there's lots of different tools. And the main reasons why they vary is what they're including in terms of their footprint. So are they looking at a farm level where they're accounting for everything that's coming onto the farm, what's happening in terms of removals, or are we looking at a supply chain footprint, which is just taking a snapshot of one enterprise that you might have on the farm? And traditionally in the past, a lot of footprints have been done looking at that supply chain footprint level, where they've only looked at emissions intensity per unit of output. They haven't taken into account a lot of what's happening in terms of the removals or the good stuff. Okay. They also can vary in terms of how much of that sort of scope 3, so the emissions that are coming onto the farm, is included, whether they use different data sources, and if all of that makes you really frustrated, there is work currently going on to try and harmonize approaches within calculators. So ideally, we will get to a point where calculators are agreeing on these sorts of things. But the other big caveat is at the moment is that we have varying standards that the calculators have to apply to you. Colleen spoke earlier about past 2050. That's one. We also have science-based targets. And so we need, although the calculators can align, but at the same point, we also need an alignment around the standards that they need to be reporting to. And then we can have both of those things together. It also depends on the data that's coming in from farmers. So how much data, apologies, my smoke alarm has just decided to go off, so if you can hear that, I'm sorry if it's upsetting your ears. the data that's coming in from farmers, how much information do you as a farmer need to put in? What's that level of interest? Because again, if you're having to put in lots of data about how you're managing those different things, that's going to require an extra level, be able to refine those emissions factors more than if you're just doing a sort of short, easy to use one. But irrespective of which calculator you use, the results is the important bit. It's the so what, it's the how can I actually use this information to actually give me a baseline, and more importantly, help me to understand where I'm going in the future. As I say, it gives you that starting point. But the really exciting bit is whichever calculator you use, once you've got your starting point, you can create different versions of your calculator and say, okay, what would be the impact if I changed my management of my grazing, for example, or if I changed what I was doing in terms of my fertilizer application? And you can scenario plan. And from doing this exercise with hundreds and hundreds of farmers, baseline, you'll get some interest. But actually, if you can show the art of the possible, that's where the magic starts to happen. And by seeing these tools as a way to help inform management, that's where you can really start to see the value to your farm. So looking at the report, categories, that give those, delving into those layers. Where are the majority of the emissions coming from in your system? That can be something that you can start to benchmark. What can you actually do to reduce them? So really trying to turn this from something which is theoretical into something which is practical. And then what are the things that you can do over the short, medium or long term? What are the things that potentially might need some equipment or some finance or some additional knowledge? But I would say that every single farmer will have something that they can do, having done a carbon footprint, that will save costs, will not require a huge amount of investment, and will help improve resilience. And this provides a way of looking at your business and trying to work out what that is. So when we start looking at those categories, again, we take that big number and then we turn it down to say, well, okay, where can we actually focus? And what we can see on this farm is, again, we might want to understand what's happening in terms of how they're managing their livestock, because that's contributing just over 61% of emissions. We then want to understand what's happening in terms of how they're managing their fuels and their inputs. And also we can see a land use down here. So we want to understand how they're managing their soils. On the other side, in terms of the benefits that's coming from how they're managing their system, we've obviously got some that's coming from soil organic matter. Obviously, they've got some woodlands and hedgerows, all of those sorts of things. But it takes it down into what is making up that big number in terms of emissions, and where are the sequestration bits coming from, which can help really start to identify and target actions. As I've said already, it's important to understand that within biological systems, carbon is cycling, okay? And we want that carbon cycle. If you think fundamentally about how farming works, taking things that we get for free, sunlight, air, water, and turning them into things that we can sell, be it crop, be it an animal product, whatever it is, okay? And how efficiently we can optimize that carbon cycle works not just in terms of emissions reductions, but also in terms of improving sequestration, because we know a huge amount of potential sits below our feet. So, but this is cycling, and that's cycling on our farm. We also have a nitrogen cycle. So not only have we got one, we've got two. And effectively, how we can understand and manage what's happening on our farm, really, really important. Again, the really important things that are precursors to helping with that nitrogen cycle is soil structure. So how much water's in there? Because if we've got those conditions which are wet, anaerobic, compacted, then any nitrogen that we're putting on, either from an organic source or an inorganic source, is going to be much more at risk of being denitrified and obviously going up into the atmosphere. And yes, that's a problem from a greenhouse gas perspective, but more importantly, that's nitrogen that you've paid to put there that is not being utilised by the plant. So really trying to understand how we can optimise these systems and how we can turn things into something which we can start to make these more efficient. Again, when we start to think about these gases, and we can turn it from something which is a little bit more theoretical in terms of the measurement into practical things. So when we can look at where those gases are coming from, when we're thinking about nitrous oxide, predominantly we're thinking about how we manage our soils, our fertilizers and our manures. And there is a huge amount of things that we can think about to try and improve nitrogen use efficiency. Again, it feeds into water quality, it feeds into nutrient optimization, it feeds into how, practically and economically. Nutrient management planning is one of those things that is a win-win-win-win-win on any environmental or business efficiency thing, because there's always things you can do. Methane, a much maligned ruminant animals. 98% of the methane that comes out of a cow or a sheep comes out the front end. Again, a loss of potential energy that could be used to grow more meat or milk. But also, what's often forgotten about, how we manage our manures and slurries. So thinking about storage, thinking about optimization of those nutrients, really important. And then, as I say, carbon dioxide, the gas that most other industries are dealing with, predominantly burning of fossil fuels, so the use of diesel, electricity. Potentially we've got opportunities for renewable energy, and then everything that's happening within our soils. So suddenly we go from something which is tons of carbon dioxide equivalent to actually we're dealing with how we're managing our rotations, our stock, our soils, our, all of these sorts of things. So it is really, really rooted in practice. But also that unique ability that we have to sequester carbon. And we can put these things into our calculator. So in terms of how do we get that data in? Well, absolutely, we want data in terms of any areas of woodland and trees, and that might be blocks of woodland, that might be that you've got a silver pasture or a silver arable system, it might be that you've just got infield trees. All of those contribute, all of those are playing a role, and we need to make sure that we're including them within our models and our methods. Hedgerows, incredibly important store of carbon, not just in terms of having those hedgerows there, but how are you managing them? Actually, how often are you trimming them? When you are trimming them, what shape are you trimming them to? All of these sorts of things, which are little things, but can make a real difference, not just to your carbon footprint, but more importantly, it also provides that really good shade, shelter, potentially incredible source of nutrients for your animals when they're out. Any areas that are potentially not crops, so if you've got field margins or little bits or scraggy bits of corners or habitats that potentially you don't think about from a carbon sequestration perspective, you absolutely be thinking about them and counting them from a biodiversity perspective. All of those also have a carbon storage value. So making sure that they're accurately included within your footprint, really, really important. And then we've got soils, which obviously are the starting point to everything that happens on the farm. Soil is our most important resource, irrespective of what we're growing, whether we're cattle farmers, arable farmers, horticultural producers. Soil is the starting point to everything. We're all soil farmers. And if we can understand and value that most important resource, then everything good will flow off the top of it, whether we're thinking about improved resilience, improved performance, improved biological populations, all of those sorts of things, which just make the job 10 times easier. As we've said already, one of the challenges is that carbon can be difficult to visualize and become familiar with, because it's not that we can see this sort of stuff arriving. And sometimes, what can be really useful is to sort of try and compare things. So you go, okay, what I could do is I could plant some more woodland, but what, and how much would planting a hectare of woodland be in compared to improving the diversity of my grassland? And trying to sort of, when we're doing scenario planning, looking at what would this equate to, can be really, really useful in terms of breaking down that literacy around actually what does a ton of carbon dioxide equivalent look like, because we don't see these things, they're not visible. So that's great, but what can we actually do about it? We can report it, we can collect the data that we need, we can make sure that we do that in as accurate a way as possible, so that the output of whichever calculator we use is a true reflection of what's happening in terms of what we're doing. But actually, how do we then link that to practical mitigation options? And it's important to remember, as I've said already, we've got these different gases that are cycling around, and it's not that the end point that we want to get to is zero emissions. It's about how do we reduce those emissions, how do we link that into farm performance, to farm profit, and to farm resilience. And there's various bits of work that's been done looking at what you can do, and that's been typified and quantified depending on type of system. So you could say this is some work that was done looking at achieving net zero in arable systems, where predominantly, if you look at where the emissions come from on a typical arable farm, 60% of your emissions are coming from fertilizer, about 20% of your emissions are coming from fuel use, field operations, about 10% coming from P&K, about 10% just under coming from the amount of embedded emissions of getting the seed to the field for you to plant. Really small proportion is coming from crop protection. So arguably, again, coming back to understanding where your emissions are coming from, you want to be focusing on nitrogen use efficiency and fuel use in field operations, because that is what is contributing the majority of your inputs. So we're then starting to think about, okay, How efficiently and how effectively are we taking those nutrients and we're turning them into yield? What are the limiting factors on there? Can we think about, is our soil or our nutrient management plans correct? Are we fully taking account of everything that we might be using in terms of integrating organic manures with purchased fertilizer? It's not about saying you must never apply fertilizer. Okay, it's about targeting those applications to what you're trying to achieve, looking at your nitrogen use efficiency curve. Where are you? Are you over applying? Can you be more precise in terms of applying it? Can you make sure that your soil conditions are right? Can you think about the type of fertilizer that you're applying to also link to the soil conditions to minimize losses? Can you think about applying a carbon source with that nitrogen to be able to support the biology in your soil? Can we start to unlock all of these sorts of things? So suddenly, as I say, it comes from something which is a little bit theoretical, turns into very, very practical, detailed conversations about how you're growing things and what you're doing from an agronomic perspective. Also then thinking about fuel use efficiency. So what is your cultivation choice? What are you doing in terms of rotation? How many times are you having to pass across that field? Can you start to think about different ways of doing it? How does that fit into your rotation? All of these things are really, really important in terms of reducing emissions. And what you can start to see when you sort of drill down a little bit is that you absolutely are some key performance indicators and benchmarks you can use. Establishment fuel cost per litres per hectare. That's a really good one that we use quite often. Can you start to drive that down? Kilos of nitrogen per hectare that you're applying. Can we start to look at, because then again, that is so linked to spend and profitability. What are the opportunities to reduce that? When we start to think about livestock, again, there are similar sorts of reports that have come out that look at what is possible in terms of achieving net zero within livestock systems. And again, there are a variety of livestock systems in there, depending on whether we're thinking about ruminants or whether we're thinking about non-ruminants. If we're focusing on non-ruminants, then the key areas to focus on: feed really represents a really big cost to the business, but also how effectively are we turning that feed into output? Are we thinking about the embedded emissions in terms of where that feed's coming from, feed sourcing? Can we start to think about opportunities for, especially for that protein requirement, where that tends to come onto the farm with a high carbon footprint, especially if the main ingredient there is soya? Can we look at other alternatives? What does that look like in terms of, amino acid profiles, all of that sort of thing? Really big one. And then also focusing on manure management. If we think about our ruminant systems, we know that, again, about half of your emissions will typically come from enteric fermentation, so that process by which our ruminant turns something that we can't eat into something that we can. But the other half of those emissions are very much coming from what you're doing around manure management, feed sourcing, fertilizer, power and fuel, all of those things, which are on a shorter time scale are much easier to do something about. So again, when we think about ruminants, we can often get depressed or focused on the bit that is the ruminant, but actually let's focus on the bit that we can do something about, which will also drive efficiency, which will drive profit. And what I would often say is that, again, you can look at a farm where the proportion of their emissions that's coming from that enteric fermentation, as that goes up, it means that they're becoming more efficient because they're dropping more of that cost out of the system. They're making the most use of what they've got. So looking at those categories, looking at how you compare to others, and more importantly, how that fuels what you might do next, is a really important step. Because if we're thinking about reducing emissions, there are some really key areas that we can focus on, as we've spoken about already. If you're a livestock farmer, then managing your livestock is really important because they will contribute quite a high proportion of your emissions. And thinking about reducing emissions goes hand in hand with how we're trying to run profitable livestock systems anyway. So we want to focus on herd health. We want to focus on key performance indicators around reproductive efficiency, around animal health and welfare, around production, around daily live weight gain, around making sure that our animals are as productive as they possibly can be, because then they can utilize that energy to actually grow or produce, rather than having to divert some of that energy to deal with a health challenge or those sorts of things. So anything that you're trying to do in terms of optimize and make your livestock system as efficient as possible will also help from a carbon footprinting perspective. Then we can think about things like feed sourcing, ration planning, as well as then thinking about what we're dealing with the stuff that's coming out the other end in terms of manure. Incredibly important resource. Are we really truly integrating what's happening in terms of the nutrient content on it and targeting its application? As I sort of mentioned already, nutrient management planning, super important. Loads of things that we can do with that. It's a win-win on any environmental measure. Soil, our most important resource. If we can get our head around managing that to improve the farm performance, then carbon will follow. Managing our grasslands or our crops, making sure we're integrating and getting the agronomy right, really important. And then energy efficiency. So all of those sorts of things turn it into something that's much more practical. And again, we can then have a variety of different metrics to be able to look at progress over time, because this sort of stuff, can continue. It doesn't need to be a one-hit wonder where we do our carbon footprint, we stick it on a shelf and we forget about it. It's how do we integrate the outputs of that into our management moving forward to help improve the performance and the resilience of our farm. So we can turn it into actually practical outcomes that we can start to see a difference from. As I've said already, it's all about the soil. How can we not only understand what's in our soil in terms of carbon sequestration, but how that also drives profitability, as well as thinking about management of hedgerows, woodlands, and all of those other bits and pieces. So just to sort of try and bring it to a close, I'm sure you've listened to me for far too long. Calculators are really important in terms of being able to assess impact. Okay, I know they can be something which can feel a little bit overwhelming to do, but managing carbon on your farm and getting to all the benefits that I've spoken about already starts by producing and understanding your baseline. You can't go anywhere until you know where you're starting from. And the calculators can be used not only to provide that baseline, but do that magic bit in terms of, so what, where can you go? How can you what do you want to do? And how can the calculator help inform where you might want to go? Remember, no calculator is perfect. Okay, this is an evolving science. It will continue to change. They will continue to get better as we understand more about these biological systems. But just because none of them are perfect, it doesn't mean that we don't need to engage with them. And again, whichever calculator you choose, if when you do your carbon footprint, there's things that you don't understand, get in touch, because they will all be more than happy to talk about how it works, the methodologies, and all of those sorts of things. Remember, it's a leaky system. So we're never going to totally eliminate these emissions, but tied into farm performance and profitability, we have opportunities. We have those levers to pull that will reduce costs and emissions. And if you do that for no other reason, it builds resilience and future-proofs your business. And, these footprint tools allow you to understand the scope of management change. So it really is a way to look at your business. So just to finish, carbon emissions and business performance are directly linked. So the nice thing is that if we're improving our business performance, if we're improving profit, if we're reducing costs, we're also reducing our emissions, which is a win-win. Because, we need to think about those things that are coming onto the farm. How efficiently are we using them? And if we do those things, and if we start to think about all of these, then everything works well. So whether that's soil outputs, whether that's animal performance, whether that's crop health or environmental health and resilience, will all improve along with those profits. So it provides a really good mechanism to start to springboard some of the things that you might want to do. So all we really need to do is just embrace them and start to realize that there is something that we can all do. Be flexible, because we're dealing with complex biological systems that are inherently dependent on the weather. And think about not just baselining your carbon, but also thinking about what's happening within your soil as your most important asset. And we got to the end. Perfect. I will stop sharing.
Thank you, Becky. I think that was almost exactly 40 minutes, which is what you said it would be. So that was super. That was a lot of, you managed to pack a lot into 40 minutes there. That was super. We have a couple of questions that I might just touch on now before we then go on to Denise. And I see a couple of people clapping there. I think that was really useful and really good to get the sort of broader picture and the detail kind of together. And a couple of people in the chat saying excellent presentation, thank you. So I'll do a couple of questions just now, and then we'll hand over to Denise and then have more sort of discussion after that. But two sort of questions specific to your presentation. The first one, wondering how you work out the offset figure. When you were talking about the offsets there, is there a sort of standard way to work that out? Is there kind of formulas?
Yeah, absolutely. So Yeah, so offset or removals, obviously, depending on what you're putting in. So if you've got woodlands, what you do is you put in the area of woodlands. That we have two ways of calculating them. So there's a sort of average figure, which looks at average lifespan of a block of woodland, depending on whether it's a mixed broadleaf or coniferous, and assigns an average value. Trees will sequester the majority of their carbon when they're a teenager, so from when they're 15 to 45. And so we also have the woodland carbon code methodology built in so that you can track the sequestration across a woodland as it matures. So there's two different ways of putting that in. Hedgerows, again, you need to put in the length and the width and the management of those hedges, and that will then afford it a sequestration value. Perennial crops, again, we have a variety of different sources within there. Habitats, so anything that's down into sort of, from things like upland unimproved grassland through to, a skylark plot in a field. What we do at the moment is that we have a sort of modelled set of sequestration factors in there that come from a review from Natural England as a starting point, which gives you an understanding. And then you can also put your soil data in. So if you've got to take account of what's happening on your soil, which is the most accurate way of understanding your management, your soil type, your climate. If you've got information from analysis from soil organic matter or soil organic carbon, you can add that information in, and that then sort of almost overrides any of the more modelled approaches for the in-field measures. So there's a variety of different things. We understand and recognise that a lot of farmers don't come in with lots of historic soil organic matter or soil organic carbon analysis. So the modelled options allow you to get a bit of an art of the possible, which can then you can then overwrite with your soil data as you build that up over time.
Super, thank you. And you sort of half answered the other question I was going to ask, which is what's the source of emissions or emission factors for field margins, perennial crops and habitats other than woodland and hedges? So you kind of covered some of that already in that answer as well.
So we use the main source that we use for that is, as I say, is a Natural England work that was done, which is used quite widely. Yes, in calculators, but also more widely in terms of for things like landscape recovery projects, where they're looking at quantifying the different habitats in terms of carbon removals.
Super, thank you. Right, we'll move on to Denise. I'm just going to quickly share. Or Denise, do you want to try and share the slides from your computer and see if it works this time, or do you want me to just share it?
I think, Colleen, can you hear me okay? I think just go ahead and share it so that I'm not sort of faffing around, just in case it doesn't, because it didn't seem to work earlier.
That's fine. This is where you sort of click the share button and it comes up with, select which window. And then this is when I realised how many different things I've got open at the same time on my computer. But yes, can you see that slide now with the carbon balance?
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. So just let me know when you want me to go to the next one.
Great.
I need to go into presenter mode.
Okay. Well, hello, everybody.
Right.
Hello, everyone. And thanks very much, Colleen, for inviting me to take part in this webinar. So I thought what I'd do, I'm going to go straight into our results. So we did a farm carbon toolkit audit last year. And then I'm going to talk a wee bit about how that's the management that influenced our decisions up to the point of the carbon audit. Then the extent to which our audit is going to inform ongoing management. I then propose to bring all of this into a bit of a wider context as to why and how and where this is taking us as an industry. So there we go. That there is an indication of our emissions as of last year. So we've got total emissions and the removals mostly from woodland and the carbon balance. If you can just go to the next slide, please, Colleen. Again, farm area, carbon balance, fuel emissions per area tiny, land use change emissions, so that you've got the kind of the picture. And then the next slide, we'll go back to these slides again. I just want to give, so that, I don't know if you can see the small print at an angle beneath the columns. So that is the carbon audit of a 100% beef, livestock, grass farm system, productive beef, organic, pasture for life. So the farm management, which has come to this point, is this has been a 10-year process. We really started looking at the farm in detail in terms of its efficiency for production in 2015. Prior to that, we were organic, so we won't use any agrochemicals. And then in 2018, we went pasture for life. So you can see that we've got rid of 3 tractors before this. So we've got 1 tractor and 1 forklift. We got rid of our pigs, got rid of our sheep. We stopped being a mixed farm, so we were all livestock. And if you have a wee look along those columns, fuels tiny, materials, inventory, crops tiny, livestock is the biggest issue, obviously because of methane emissions. Waste disposal, not that this particular audit would have taken full account of the fact that we're now completely outdoors, so we have no housing. And then our hedgerows and our trees are our greatest offset. So if you just bear in mind that it's all grass, all livestock, it's been a 10-year journey of discovering how we can really, as a business, become more efficient, but also very conscious of our environmental impact. So can you go to the next slide, please, Colleen? So what we've got there, now this is really helpful. This gives us an idea of where we are as an average farm within the Farm Carbon Toolkit dataset. So our total emissions are 1.74 tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent below the median average for this selection. This is for all UK farms. And this puts us in the lowest 40% of the selected data. A next slide, please. I hope there is a next slide. Was there a next one? No, it doesn't matter.
No, that was the last one.
So from our point of view, that also gives us an idea of what our emissions are of our live weight of produce, which is again below the median. So first of all, these results tell us that the farming up to the point of the audit is providing a benefit, but we've still got a lot to do in terms of environment. It's providing a benefit in terms of cost and fuel and energy and effort efficiency. And effort is important kind of energy. And also from our point of view, we sell our meat direct. So it's a good news story for our customers to demonstrate that when they're buying product from us, from our farm, it actually has a lower impact than possibly other farms that are more intensive. So that's the good news of what we're doing. So what it did for us, the whole process of measuring our carbon was a revelation. So last year we measured the carbon, I have to admit, prompted by the whole farm plan and incentivized by the contribution toward the cost. We had to go through a consultant in order to get the invoice, so there was little bits of detail like that. For us, it was a revelation, in spite of the fact that we think that we're reasonably open-minded farmers, and we've made some quite radical changes and some tough decisions, not least because the drive has to be that we actually are a profitable farm. Doing this deep dive into what the total impact of our farming was in relation to our environment and effort and energy was really enlightening for us. But also it makes you realize that what the data gives us is a guardrail. You know, no data, and I'm sure Becky will agree with this, there's no such thing as absolute, and there's no absolute data. Data simply gives us a guardrail of a direction of travel. And this has given us a much stronger guardrail to support decisions that we need to make. But so having done this as a sole business in our sector, it doesn't make any sense doing it for ourselves, which is why actually it's very important to bear in mind that this is a whole sector exercise, that in order to make the scale impact that we have to make, we need to be one of a number of farms doing carbon audits, soil audits, biodiversity audits, and the audits necessary for the whole farm plan that Colleen referred to in the introduction. And it's not just our sector, but also it's our industry and its society. So this is a hugely collaborative drive to address our existential predicament. So not only is it extremely valuable for us as a business and as a sector, but it is absolutely valuable for our society that we do this. So there's a huge responsibility to really measure the impact of what we're doing in our production of goods for society, but also obviously what we can use this information for is the production of a public good, which of course as a sector we're being pushed more and more to do, and maybe in time we can put a value on the public goods that this audit actually delivers. I'm also very mindful that carbon is only one factor, and Becky alluded to the issue of nitrogen, nitrous oxide, but also we need to bear in mind water vapor. So these are all mutually interactive cycles. I have a background in ecology, so I tend to my discussions tend to default to sort of ecological rationalization and reasoning of how and what we do. But these are mutually interactive, highly complex cycles, and carbon, and of course nitrous oxide and CH4, methane are all part of this complexity. But as a business, being able to identify how we can make decisions to make things better is really, really valuable. So, I mean, obviously, Becky's alluded to the fact that, you know, the measurements will become more fine-tuned. We have at least got, you know, carbon equivalent and the GWT star, which is useful for us as an industry. But going back, if we can just pop up to the top slide, I think it is, Colleen. Yeah, so just let's have a look at, oh, sorry, no, the second slide. So if we just have a look at the emissions, so that the emissions are absolutely, totally our livestock, our beef. And as you'll have noticed from the second slide, there's not an awful lot more that we can do to reduce our fuels and to reduce our emissions. So again, you know, if you go to the, yeah, if you have a look at that, fuel, yeah, we can do a little bit more, materials. There's not a lot more that we can do to reduce our emissions other than get rid of our cows, which we're not going to do. But what we can do, and this is how we are actually informing how we manage our farm going forward, we've spent a lot of time in actually looking at the efficiency of our cattle. So that in terms of productivity from an all grass, all outdoor system, improved calving, reduction in vet and med, we know that we can do a lot more there. We are working, we have done a lot of work. We're going to do more work on the genetic capability of, we have Aberdeen Angus, so we're working on the Aberdeen Angus genetics to produce better off grass. So Angus, my son, who's the principal partner of our business, is working with other Aberdeen Angus breeders to look at the kind of breeding that will work best off an all grass, zero grain system. So that's one aspect. Also the efficiency of calving, our pregnancy diagnosis results of this year, our heifers were 100%, our first calvers were 98%. So we've got a very good fecundity, if you like, but taking that to live weight gain, we have to make sure that obviously we sometimes lose a calf at calving, and we've just got to get better at all of that hands-on management. It's not to say that we're good. I think we are very good, but we can always be a lot better. And these are areas where we can improve our livestock productivity. And while it won't demonstrate or won't show in the emissions, because obviously the modelling of methane from the front end of a cow is a model, I am hoping that perhaps there could be some fine-tuning in relation to the sorts of management that we're doing. But we know anyway, because, if I can just make this point, measurement is important, but it's not the be-all and end-all. It's not the absolute. We can't wait for measurement results before we manage. We often know that we have to manage before we get the measurement. But we know as farmers, and I'm sure most of you as farmers will know too, that there are areas that you can improve in terms of productivity and your own efficiency effort levels that will improve a carbon audit without having to wait for the results. So that's not to put you off doing the audit, because that's very essential. So if we can just go back up to the top slide, please. No, to be the second slide, sorry. So if we just, again, we can have a look at the carbon balance per dead weight. That's very important for us as beef producers, and the carbon balance per area. So we know when we do the KPI testing that the Farm Carbon Toolkit brilliantly gives you, which you're able to do with the Farm Carbon Toolkit, that in both the carbon balance per area and carbon balance per dead weight, we are well below the median. So again, this tells us that we're actually on a good journey, but there's an awful lot more to do. One or two other things. Yes, so going forward, in terms of how the carbon audit has informed, or is currently informing our decision making, we need to double the area of woodland to counteract, to really balance our methane emissions from our cattle. We've got a lot of replanting to do. We also, we planted, and thank you, Nature Scott. I see Selena's in the audience from Nature Scott, through the Nature Restoration Fund. We received funding to plant 11 kilometres of hedgerow on our farm and 3 surrounding farms, but 8 kilometres were planted here. So we planted them as hedgerow thickets, so they're 3 metres wide. We're never going to trim them. Our cattle are going to help us do that. I selected a species, native species selection that also includes self-medicating species for cattle, including willow, and high tannin species as well. And, if it comes to it, there's also quite a lot of human foraging potential in all the species that I selected. But so that informed our decision before the carbon audit, but it's a very important part of our emissions balance. But going forward, we do have more, we will be planting more trees to counter our livestock balance, and we will be improving our livestock management. When it comes to grassland management, we're actually, most of our cattle now are on a farm that when we took it over, my husband and I, in 1993, had been continuously cropped intensively, arable for at least 15 years, year on year, without a break. And we are, at the moment, we have got scope to improve soil organic matter, which, in spite of the way we're farming, is taking quite a lot to budge upwards. So we've got huge scope or potential there to improve soil organic matter, to basically redress the impact of decades, possibly, of year-to-year intensive high fertility, high agrochemical input arable farming. So I think that's probably as much as I can say, Colleen, for the moment, but I'm very happy, obviously, to respond to any questions.
Yeah, I think that's great. Thanks, Denise. And I had a question before I skimmed through the chat there of the other questions about kind of how livestock breed can influence kind of having a lower carbon footprint. But I think you kind of answered that question. And because we sort of sometimes talk about native breeds, for example, being lower impact, and especially if they're able to sort of finish off grass and having that whole kind of integrated system and how you're managing their health and stuff, and the genetics that comes into that as well. But I think you've kind of answered that. So I'm just going to have a quick scroll through the questions in the chat there. Unless Jane, if you've already got a sight of those, if you want to shout any out.
Hi, I'm scrolling down as well. Did you mention Celine's questions?
Yeah, I'm just seeing them just now. I'll read out. There's two from Celine. I would have expected a pasture for life organic farm that's planting lots of hedgerows to be below the lowest 40% of emissions. What's the element, Denise, that you're thinking of tweaking next in your farm practice? And I think you sort of partly answered that around the sort of genetics and efficiency of livestock. But
yeah, I can quickly pop in there. So that KPI, and you know, obviously those were I had hoped to have a real-time look at our results, but unfortunately I couldn't screen share those. So they were what my slides actually were screenshots. But actually, if I put the KPI for Scotland in, Celine, our median is very much, our difference is very much higher. So what I showed there was for the UK, but Scotland, there's a much bigger difference. So our median, our average is where we are is much below the actual average. So we can put different KPIs in, which actually fine tune our results.
Yeah, thanks. That's useful, and that ties into what Becky was saying about sort of scenario planning and putting in different scenarios and kind of seeing how they compare, and what if we did this, or if you compare it to that.
Yeah, extremely really helpful.
Yeah, to be able to sort of compare things. There's a question at the bottom here. Would sward lifting of grassland help or hinder carbon sequestration? I don't know which of you want to.
That's a Becky.
Yeah,
that one.
Yeah, more than happy to answer that. So the answer with anything carbon is it depends. So that's the starting point. But what if you think about it? If you've got grasslands which are compacted, those grasslands are not going to be performing particularly well. So with any of these sorts of things, yes, if you can get more air into the system, that means that your roots are happier, which means that your fields are going to be more resilient, which hopefully means that your grasslands are going to perform better. So in theory, you're going to have to bring in less feed or less whatever else you're doing with it. Now, what I would say is that, you know, it depends. The first thing to do is to dig a hole. So go and look at how severe is the compaction, where is the compaction. Then it's that conversation about, well, actually, do we need to solve this mechanically, or is this something that roots will do over time? Because, you know, arguably, especially if you've got, you know, the best crop for soil health is grassland. And so if you can, you know, if you can manage your stock and if you've got enough time, patience, then roots will do it for you. But it's that first bit of identification. Because as I say, if you've got wet compacted soils, then that soil is going to be emitting nitrous oxide. And from a potency perspective, nitrous oxide is much more potent as a greenhouse gas than carbon is. So I'm very happy for you to go in and burn a bit of carbon to actually remediate that action. Then mean you've got a much more healthy functioning soil, which is more likely to sequester carbon and is more likely to mean that you've got things. What I would say is that sward lifting is a short-term solution. So what we don't want to be doing is routinely sward lifting. What we want to do is try and over the long term understand why we're getting to the point where we're needing that. So is that the way that we're managing our stock? in terms of potentially we're leading to a little bit of compaction with the stock being there too long? Is it that we haven't got enough resilience built into the pasture? So do we need more deeper rooting species? Is it that actually it's just been a blooming wet year and, you know, we're always going to be compacted? And it's just about asking the why, which is really, really important. But, you know, sometimes when we think about carbon, we get this really narrow view that thou must never put a machine in the ground at all. That's actually not the case. If we're doing that for a informed reason, because at the moment we need that field to perform for us, that's fine over the short term. But what we need to think about is how can we minimize our need to do that long term, and can we bring more roots into the rotate, you know, roots to be able to do that job for us.
Thanks, Becky. That was really useful. Hopefully that was useful. And just seeing Jane's putting some links in the chat, which would be useful for people to click on if you're interested. We've got some technical guides, and the resources page has a lot of stuff on it. We will also send these out in a follow-up email later in the week. So don't worry if it finishes the webinar and you didn't click on it yet. But just to flag those. And there was another question about whether carbon audits, or the one that Denise has used, if there's soil carbon store and sequestration data. Yes, I see Becky nodding. I'll let you answer that one.
Yeah, I can certainly start, and then I say Denise can come in. So again, it sort of comes back to one of the questions earlier about why, you know, if you're a pasture-fed extensive system, why are you still, you know, why you're not already well beyond where you should be? Because like I said earlier, what you'll find with Denise's system is that the majority of her emissions, you know, much more than 50% is coming from the livestock because they've taken everything else out of the system. And what I said earlier is that if you haven't got lots of data to be able to back that up, then what you end up with is you end up with a lot of emissions that are just coming from the animals. Then obviously, as Denise said, you can put in your woodlands, you can put in your hedgerows, but the bit that's missing is actually how you are managing the grassland, the impact that the animals are having in terms of grazing, all of those sorts of things. And until you can build up that repository of soil data, you know, yes, absolutely, you can put the modelled figures in, and if you've got, you know, nice diverse pastures, you can put that sort of bits in, but it's always only ever going to be a modelled version until you've got your data. And so that's the real challenge, and that's why I don't want livestock farmers to feel disheartened when you look like you look like you're doing everything right and you've made all the steps, but actually it's still showing that. And that's because, you know, as I say, it takes time to build up that body of evidence to be able to put in, and we need to understand that. And that's where it comes down to almost, you know, understanding the results of that footprint to say which are the things that you can do something about and which are the things that are inherently just as a result of having livestock, you know. And as Denise says, if you can make that system as efficient as possible, then, you know, you need to accept that the emission, you know, as I say, we've got leaky systems. There are going to be emissions that come from somewhere, and as long as those emissions are coming from your main product. But, you know, ideally, we can start to pull that data in terms of soil data in, and then the question becomes: are those figures going up? Are they staying the same, or are they going down? And again, it's not going to be a lovely linear example where they're all going to do this. But if over time you're seeing that you're building organic matter, you don't need to be changing it much to have a really big impact on your footprint. So, you know, small gains can make a really big difference. But it's getting the data together to be able to show that side of it, which, you know, compared to some of the habitats where you can just put in the areas.
Thanks, Becky. Denise, did you want to add anything to that?
Well, a wee bit, and maybe a slight aside, was that there isn't a lot of grassland doesn't really come into the offsets. I mean, you know, we had countryside stewardship, hedgerows, wetland, and also obviously woodland, but there's no permanent pasture, which we go to a lot of trouble managing for biodiversity and our cattle. So I'm just wondering, you know, not exactly related to the question, but still relevant, what the situation is there.
And I think that's the problem, is that, like I said, you know, there are values. So you can put in low input permanent pasture as a modelled value, and it will give you a really small value. So it will give you about, you know, 0.3 tonnes a hectare. So you can put it in as a starter. But the problem that we have is that, you know, unlike a hedgerow or one of those sorts of things, there are so many variables in terms of grassland, in terms of depending on soil type management, all of those sorts of things. You know, that's why if you've got information about soil analysis in terms of how you're managing your permanent pasture, then that's the most accurate level of information. So it's almost, it's a question that we get often. What about my grass? Well, yes, grass can be absolutely incredible in terms of sequestering carbon, but also, if that grassland is not managed well, it can also be emitting. And so grass isn't just grass. There's lots of different variations of that. And so the sort of stepped approaches to do that is that you can make sure that your area of grassland is included as a modelled value using those sort of countryside stewardship type options, where you can, depend on whether you've got lots of deeper rooting species or whether you've got, predominantly sort of a or you can then go that next step further when you collect that soil information to say, on my grassland, the way I'm managing my permanent pasture with my grazing practices and these sorts of things, this is what's happening on my soil type. And that's the real challenge that we've got, is that it's quite easy for us to put the information about the emissions, but we have to wait a bit of time to collect the data to be able to show the good side, which is why we've ended up with some of the narratives and the conversations that we've had, because it's been much easier to assess one side rather than looking at it in the round.
Mm-hmm. The joy of complex systems.
Absolutely.
We have just a few minutes left, so we've got time for one more question, which I'll ask, and then also get Jane to put the link in the chat for a very quick feedback survey. So if people can click on that link and start filling that out while we answer the final question, that'd be super. And then we'll finish in a few minutes. But the last question that we've got, another one just coming from Celine, but the one to get you to answer first: are carbon emissions lessened when pasture is flooded? And I think I know the answer to that. But yeah, I'll let you start answering that, and then Jane's just put the link in the chat for the quick feedback survey. If people can fill that out, that'd be super.
Yeah, no worries. So in terms of wetlands or flooded bits, what we tend to say is that if they're wet, what happens is when they're wet, it decreases the amount of biological activity, so the respiration that's happening from the bugs that live within your soil. So that tends to be afforded a benefit in terms of carbon, because there's not as much loss coming out through respiration. Having said that, if land is wet, depending on the soil type or those sorts of things, it can then generate emissions from methane, or other bits and pieces. So again, as I said at the beginning, it depends. It depends how long it's flooded for. It depends what you're doing in terms of a management perspective. But wetlands as a whole, and be that sort of high organic matter wetlands in terms of things like peatlands or other types of wetlands, can be accounted for within the calculator. And as I say, if they're wet for quite a long time, then they're usually afforded a small amount of sequestration due to the suppression in microbial activity.
Super, thank you. And that sort of ties into soil management and the sort of more organic matter. The better you're managing the soil, the more it's sort of active. If it can hold water for longer and sort of flow the flow of water through the farm and kind of then
absolutely
lessen drying out not so quickly as well, all kind of helps lots of other things as well. And yeah, the last kind of comment from Celine saying, hoping the ADHD is that HDB environmental baselining project will help produce some good data for Scotland for soil carbon models. So that is sort of in the pipeline, and will be, I think, a link for that on our website in due course, I think. So yes, while people are filling out that quick feedback survey, we'll also email that afterwards. Thank you so much to our speakers today, Denise and Becky. Very well matched there, and I think we've got a lot of things to mull over and think about in the background of our heads today after this. It's been really, really useful and good to kind of see the kind of bigger picture and the theory and the practice and the detail, kind of how that all fits together. So I think a lot of folk, it looks like I found that really valuable. So thank you very much to both of you. And thank you everybody who's attended and for listening. And we'll share more information afterwards in a follow-up email. And we've got more webinars coming up on all the different whole farm plan audit areas if you're interested in any other of those. So thank you very much. And I hope everybody has a good rest of their day and go and enjoy some lunch.
Great, thanks, Colleen. Nice to see you, Becky.